let's see if I can make that stick. Okay. So those of you that have studied climate science, you would have seen this graph. This is CO2 emissions models and observations. So those straight colored lines going back to just before 2000 were attempts by several groups around the world to create scenarios for what emissions might happen in the future. Right? So that red line that you see in the very top line there is a pathway that has high carbon usage, low penetration of renewable energy, big explosions in economic growth, right? The kind of high carbon pathway. And the low one, of course, is one that assumes quicker penetration of renewables, maybe less demand for fossil fuels, a number of factors that would drive. And so those were the boundaries for the scenarios. The dotted line represents actual observed emissions. Right? So you don't need to read 2,000 pages in the IPCC's current AR5, Fifth Assessment Report. If you look at this graph, it tells you a very simple story. Emissions are tracking higher than were modeled, right, roughly 10 years ago. Okay? So this is my idea of a definitive climate change response failure. We've been negotiating 2 agreements under the United Nations auspices since 1990, Framework Convention on Climate Change in Kyoto, and over that entire period of time, and emissions are higher than what we projected them to be. Right? Okay. All right. So what's the conventional wisdom? I mentioned this, right? The conventional wisdom is reducing carbon emissions means agreeing to be a bit poor in the future. Reducing carbon emissions lowers future GDP growth. Right? And even the third assessment report, which just came out, says that in 2030 and 2050, we are going to be a little bit poor if we invest in reducing emissions. But good news is it's not very much. Don't worry. The problem with this being the prevailing narrative, the conventional wisdom, is that it leads to massive roadblocks in negotiations. The first one is, and if you follow the negotiations, you know this term, common but differentiated responsibilities. And this is language that says that major developing countries like China and India, they're on the planet and they have to share some responsibility, but not the same responsibility as developed countries, right? So you know the Kyoto Protocol places obligations first on industrialized countries and then creates obligations, well, it's at some point in the future for these countries to join. If you think this is going to be expensive, right, then you're going to push for a deal like this, right? Because you don't want to be hit. You're trying to grow as fast as you can. If someone has told you this is going to be a constraint on growth, the last thing you want is a constraint on growth. You're going to push for a deal that gives you some kind of advantage.